looks like somebody made this. That's the first impression that everyone has, whether they're Christian or even an atheist. And the Bible affirms that intuition that we all have in Romans chapter 1, verse 20. It indicates that design implies there must be a designer. Creation implies there must be a creator. It says here that we can know God exists. His invisible attributes, namely his eternal power, his divine nature, the fact that this is God rather than just some designer within nature itself. No, it's obvious that God has eternal power and he is divine. And this has been clearly perceived, Romans tells us, ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. In fact, this verse says it's so clear that people don't even have any excuse not to believe. Nobody will be able to stand up before God on Judgment Day and say, it wasn't clear to me that you were real. God can say, no, the evidence was all around you in the creation. But it's not just the Bible that affirms these things. As I mentioned, even atheists at least admit that the world looks like it was designed. Take, for example, Richard Dawkins, who is one of the most prominent atheists in the world today, a strong defender of evolution, the idea that molecules turned into mankind over millions of years. And in a book, he writes all about evolution. On page 1 of that book, look at the way he defines the science of biology. He says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So this atheist does not actually believe living things were designed. He spends the whole rest of the book trying to say this appearance of design is a mistake, it's an illusion, it's not true. We're being fooled into seeing design. But he admits up front the world looks like it was designed. Tremendously complicated, sophisticated features in living things. Or another example would be Francis Crick. Sadly, this man is also an atheist. He's one of the people that co-discovered the structure of DNA. And look at what he says to his fellow biologists. Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Why do these brilliant men of science have to keep reminding themselves that evolution is fact? Well, because even to them, the world appears to be designed. Now, it is true that sometimes we can think we're seeing design and be mistaken about that. To be fair to these atheists, there are good examples of that, like my favorite example would be when the Voyager spacecraft, back in 1976, when it was flying out past the planet Mars for the first time, took a number of photographs of the landscape, the different craters and hills, and one of the details in one photo from this satellite image came back looking like this. You see the hill right in the center. Looks like it's got a face carved into it, right? Staring up into space. And some people at the time got all excited about this. They called it the face on Mars and claimed it was proof that intelligent aliens, extraterrestrials, Martians, were responsible for designing this hillside. But the appearance of a face is kind of superficial, right? And so it's likely not surprising to you folks that years later, when we had a different satellite flying past that hill and mapping it out from a different angle with different lighting, it doesn't actually resemble a face. It's easy to explain that hillside and the appearance of a face by natural processes alone, by gravity and erosion and wind and so forth. And it doesn't require the implication that there must have been an intelligent designer behind that hill. And so the atheists want to say, you see, life is like that. Once we discovered evolution, it turns out the appearance of design is a mistake. It's an illusion. It's not real. We just think we're seeing design. It's not really there at all. That's their claim, but I want to say not so fast. I would argue rather life is very different than this case. Imagine, for instance, if a new satellite flew past that hillside and the photos came back looking like this, then we would know, even if we don't know who the designer was, it would be very clear that this type of structure with these details that look like a face, that's not going to be produced by natural processes alone. It requires something beyond the laws of physics and chemistry, right? When the details are sophisticated and complicated, that is a clear indicator that a designer is responsible. And so I want to say, no, the case of living things is a lot more like this second example. So what we want to do in this hour is look at 4 different reasons from biology that many evolutionists say are good proofs of evolution. This is the kind of evidence for evolution that high school students will read about in their biology textbooks. But we're going to see these same 4 reasons. Actually, when you dive into the details, just like that Martian hillside, they more strongly support creation. The 4 areas are vestigial structures. We'll talk about what those are. Then we'll look at the similarities in living things. Then we'll consider the changes that living things undergo. And last, we'll talk about how there's a lot of cruelty in the realm of nature, in living things in particular. And so again, I want to say, even though evolutionists think that these are good arguments for evolution, once you dive into the complexity and the sophistication and the details, the impression of design does not disappear, it grows even stronger. So let's take these one at a time. This will be an outline for our first hour together. First, vestigial structures. What does that word vestige mean? A vestige is like a remnant or a trace of something. So if you walk along a beach and you see different human footprints there on the sand, those footprints are a vestige that someone once walked there. A human being made those footprints. And what evolutionists claim is that in the human body, for example, we have all sorts of organs and structures that are useless today, but they show that we had ape-like ancestors and other animal ancestors before that. These useless body parts are just leftovers from a long, millions of years evolutionary process. Now, in principle, creationists don't necessarily deny that there could ever be a vestigial structure, because although we don't believe in evolution, we do believe that after God created the world very good, there was a fall, the entrance of sin, which brought death into the world. And since that time, many things, as our DNA has been copied from generation to generation, there can be things that break and go wrong. And so there are examples in nature of true vestigial structures, like in many dark caves, you'll find that the creatures like fish and salamanders, they are like hatched from eggs, and they have no pigment in their skin, and they're also born blind with just scar tissue where their ancestors once had eyes. So here's an example of a blind cave fish without pigment. And why is that? Well, it seems to be that having eyes, functioning eyes, is no use in a dark cave. And so these organisms have complex genetic mechanisms that switch off the instructions to make their eyes, and they're born blind. And so evolutionists look at this and they say, oh, see, this is proof of evolution, because these creatures, God obviously didn't make them that way. They descended from fish that could see, and there's a dramatic change in their genetic structure that produces blindness. But notice how that's not a good proof of evolution, because what's difficult for evolution to explain is how to create eyes in the first place. It's easy to break and damage things and to switch off genes that already existed. That's not what we need the evolutionists to explain. So yes, we agree that these blind fish came from ancestors that could see, but that's not good proof of evolution. It's consistent with the fall and destruction, deterioration since the beginning. But the problem here is that when it comes to claims about vestigial structures, the evolutionists have been very over-enthusiastic in thinking that our bodies are filled with useless organs. Back 100 years ago, at the time of the Scopes trial, that famous monkey trial in Tennessee about the teaching of evolution in public schools, they had many different evolutionist scientists who testified as experts on the witness stand to show the evidence for evolution. And one of the things they appealed to was this claim about vestigial organs. They said that there are no less than 180 vestigial structures in the human body alone. But just because they didn't know what the function of these structures was that a good proof that they actually had no function? Not at all, because in the 100 years since then, we've learned that essentially every one of these organs actually does have a function. The scientists at the time just weren't aware. And I'm sure you've heard of many of these things, like your tonsils, your appendix, the tailbone, and so forth. I was astonished back in 2017 when I visited the American Museum of Natural History in New York to come across this sign about the tailbone, the human coccyx, which is this little triangular bone right at the bottom of our spinal column, at the part of our pelvis there in the back. And here's what the sign said at this world-class museum. Look at the base of the human spine and you'll find a tailbone, 3 to 5 vertebrae fused together. It serves no purpose, except it reminds us that humans have descended from ancestral animals with tails. Really? Is that the only purpose of our tailbone? It has no function whatsoever? What shocked me about this is a world-class institution. You have all kinds of scientists employed as curators. You've got scientists coming through this museum day after day. They have to know that anatomy textbooks, physiology textbooks tell us about the functions of this tailbone. It has all kinds of muscles and tendons and ligaments attached to it that help to do things like support the floor, underneath where our internal organs are stored there inside our abdomens and so forth. They're also used for different functions themselves, those muscles. So they're anchored to the tailbone, and then the muscles themselves serve a function. So the tailbone is an anchor for those muscles. Also, when we're seated, the tailbone serves as something that, like a leg of a tripod. There's 2 bones in front of our pelvis, and then the third is that tailbone in the rear that helps to bear our weight while we're sitting. And depending on how we shift, that it bears more or less of the weight. And there are other purposes as well, giving birth and other functions that our bodies perform daily that I won't go into, that the tailbone is useful in having to do with. And so even though it can maybe be damaged and you can live without it, there's plenty of body parts that you can live without. It doesn't prove they have no function, right? You can live without arms. It doesn't prove your arms are useless. Or another example, the appendix I mentioned, which is this little worm-like process that comes off your large intestine. Well, we're still not entirely clear about the functions of the appendix, but it seems to be involved in the immune system. And one purpose we know at least that it does serve is that when you get certain types of diseases and you expel a lot of the contents of your stomach, that can include like all the bacteria, the good bacteria that you use in digestion, leave your gut. And so what happens is this appendix is like a safe house, a storage unit that contains more of the good bacteria, and they can repopulate your gut and help you to recover quickly and continue to digest properly. But even if we don't fully understand all the purposes of the appendix, no evolutionist should claim that this is a useless organ any longer, because after they investigated all sorts of creatures that have appendixes, there's different types, and because of the way they're distributed in the animal population, the evolutionists said it looks like the appendix didn't just come into being one time, but it evolved on separate branches of the evolutionary tree over and over and over again, just by pure coincidence. Not because of natural selection, but because of chance, the appendix kept emerging. So even if they don't understand what it does, clearly it must have a function to appear in all these different animals that use it for those purposes. And my brother, sadly, one time he had an operation, and the doctors actually removed his appendix without his permission because they had this evolutionary mindset that, oh, this doesn't do anything anyway. As long as we're in there, let's just, snip this off, get rid of that. No, we need to correct that thinking even in the medical community. I think the Bible has the right understanding of the design of human beings. It says that the psalmist said, "I praise you, Lord, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well." So the first argument for evolution about vestigial structures, in principle, that there could be real examples. There are genuine ones caused by the entrance of sin and death. But most of these examples that you'll even find in textbooks and museums today, things that they once thought useless, now we understand they must be functional. So let's look at a second argument. That is the similarities in living things. Now, this is a very common way that evolution is argued for in textbooks. You'll typically see a diagram like this one, where you've got 4 different limbs of very different creatures, and creationists believe these were created separately. They're not related by blood. But humans use their arms for a variety of purposes. Frogs use their legs for hopping. Birds use their wings for flying, and seals use their flippers for swimming. And the evolutionists say, but look at the similar pattern in the bone structure. You've got one bone in the upper arm and an elbow joint, two bones in the lower arm or leg, and then a wrist joint or ankle, and then 5 bones in the hand or the feet. And so they say the reason that this same pattern goes through all kinds of diverse organisms is because the common ancestor of all these creatures, millions of years ago, they evolved from some ancestor that already had that same bone pattern. It's proof of evolution. Now, the creationists can, of course, respond, that's not a good proof of evolution because we find similarities even in man-made, manufactured objects. You can find these same sorts of patterns in robot arms, for example. There's a good engineering purpose why the limbs would be designed in that way. And God might have other reasons for producing these similarities. Maybe he wanted to show that it was one designer behind all of life rather than multiple gods who created the variety of creatures that we have today. Even aesthetic purposes, God could have those reasons as well. But are we just sort of at a standoff where the evolutionists say, well, our explanation makes good sense, and the creationists say, our explanation makes good sense? Or can we decide which is the better explanation? I think, just like that Martian landscape, when you dive into the details, the creation explanation is the better one. Because if the evolutionary explanation were true, that the 5-digit hand pattern arose because the common ancestor of humans and frogs, for instance, already had that 5-digit limb pattern, then you would expect, as humans develop as embryos and as frogs develop as embryos, that the 5 digits would be constructed in the same sort of way, the same sort of process that gives rise to the 5 digits. But it turns out the process is quite different. In the human hand, it starts out like a plate, and the material in between the fingers dissolves away to form the digits. Whereas the frog foot begins like a stump, a fist, and the digits grow from initial buds. They grow upward and outward. And so that defies the evolutionary expectation. And there are loads of problems like this, all kinds of, when you look into the genetic mechanisms that code for these things, also sometimes they have different genes that arrive at the same end solution. And there are also examples where we have similarities in the world of living things that no evolutionist would claim, despite how incredibly similar they are, they don't say that's because of a shared ancestor. Take the camera lens eye that vertebrates have. Human beings have a camera lens eye, but so do octopuses. And an octopus is not even a vertebrate. It doesn't even have a backbone. It's a very different creature. Evolutionists would say it's extremely distantly related on the evolutionary tree. None of them say that the reason they also have a camera lens eye is because the common ancestor of humans and octopuses already had this setup. No, again, here they have to say, just by chance, on 2 completely different branches of the evolutionary tree, the camera eye evolved more than once. And eyes in general are a difficulty for evolution because there are lots of different types of eyes in nature. The editor of Scientific American here, John Rennie, says it now appears in various families of organisms that eyes have evolved again and again independently. Some evolutionists say as many as 60 different times. Now, you folks probably thought, man, eyes are so complicated, it would be very difficult to explain them even once by natural processes alone. But imagine that this happened over 60 times. That's a bit hard to believe. No, I suggest blind forces of nature cannot make a seeing eye. And again, the Bible has the best explanation of how they came about. The hearing ear and the seeing eye, Proverbs tells us, the Lord has made them both. As I mentioned, in principle, this argument about similarities proving evolution is just not a good route to take because we can arrange man-made objects into trees as well, nested hierarchies, right? Like, think about automobiles. Some have 2 wheels, some have 3 wheels, some have 4 wheels, some are powered by gasoline, right? Like, you can arrange manufactured objects into a tree. It doesn't prove that they evolved by natural processes. Or the evolution of Mexican food, right? Did the chimichanga and the fajita both come from a tortilla millions of years ago? Not at all. These were designed by intelligent human beings. And the fact that you can make a tree doesn't prove they are related. So we've looked at two arguments for evolution, vestigial structures and similarities in living things. What about the changes that we see going on all around us? Now, many of the changes that evolutionists point to are genuine. Bacteria can become resistant to antibiotics, animals adapt to different environments, and so forth. But do you realize this is something that was acknowledged by Bible-believing creationists even before Charles Darwin? Just look at the domestic dogs that we have in the world today. It's not as though creationists deny that animals can adapt and change. And these are produced by, human interference, artificial selection, humans getting involved in the process of choosing which dogs mate with which and so forth. But they've been able to take an original wolf-like creature and produce all kinds of varieties, all kinds of specialties with, small little dogs and great big dogs and floppy ears and straight up ears and so forth. None of these modern breeds were around at the time of Adam and Eve. They've been developed in recent centuries. So there weren't any chihuahuas around in the Garden of Eden. That shows that creationists have long acknowledged that animals can change. This is a development from a more robust ancestor. And this can happen by natural processes as well. But creationists do also believe that there are limits to these changes. Evolutionists think just because we see changes, that means the change is unlimited. It can produce anything at all. But that's not true. The Bible would indicate that there are limits, and yet that there's great variety. For instance, the animals that went onto the ark with Noah were the land vertebrates only. Okay, that's creatures with a backbone, right? So no congressmen, for example. But not all the fish and so forth, not all the invertebrates that live in the ocean, but the land-dwelling, air-breathing vertebrates are the ones that he brought. And so, like from the two canines on Noah's Ark, that gave rise to all the varieties of dogs and wolves and coyotes and dingoes and so forth that we have today. That's a lot of variation that we would expect from Scripture. But we also have the statement in Genesis 1, over 10 times it talks about God making distinct kinds of plants and animals, each to bring forth after its kind. And so you can't make a tree of life that goes back to a single ancestor for all living things. No. There were original kinds and lots of adaptation and variation within each kind today. It's also clear on different days of creation week that God made distinct kinds from one another. Man was made from dust, and so we're not related to the apes. And yet the Bible doesn't use the word species. Do you notice that? It talks about God making distinct kinds of plants and animals. But how then does the term species relate to the biblical kind? Well, take cats for an example here. The large cats like lions, tigers, leopards, they're classified as different species today. But are they three different kinds, therefore? Did God have to create lions separately from tigers? Or did Noah, bringing the animals on the ark, bring two lions as well as two tigers? Or could it be that he just brought two cats? And since the time of Noah's flood, we've had a lot of diversification of the cat kind into different species. Well, one way we can know and test whether these are three different kinds or one kind is to see that if we can breed them together and produce offspring. And that's actually been done with lions and tigers, for example. Do you know what you get if you cross a male lion and a female tiger? You get a liger. And these are real large cats, very healthy. And it's a tigon, by the way, if you do the other way, the male tiger and a female lion. But they're not mythical beasts with magical powers. These are real healthy cats, showing that the cat kind is broader than lions and tigers. There's just one cat kind that includes all the cats we have today. And it's not just cats, but we can show you some other examples with different mammals. If you cross a camel and a llama, that gives you a comma. If you cross a cow and a buffalo, that makes a beefalo. A zebra and a donkey makes a zonkey. Zebra and a horse makes a zorse. A goat and a sheep makes a jeep. No, actually, a jeep is what you drive. It's pronounced a geep. A pig and a boar cross. Nobody has even named that one. In the wild, there was a polar bear that crossed with a grizzly bear to produce a Pizzly bear. And even at SeaWorld, at one point, they had in the same tank what's called a false killer whale in the same tank with a dolphin. And one of them became pregnant and surprised the people at SeaWorld. And eventually along came a baby dolphin calf. And so what's the point of all this? To show you that the Bible would lead us to expect there's lots of diversity within each kind. Camels, llamas, alpacas, that's all one kind. But the changes have limits. You're never going to cross a camel with a polar bear, right? Or much less a dolphin. And so evolutionists have the wrong idea here. The professors talking to the students often say things like, how can you deny evolution? I can see it. I observe it happening in my laboratory. But what's he observing? It's just the variations on living things that are changes within a kind of organism. Whereas when the student hears that word evolution, he is led to believe that there's a tree of life that involves all living things that ever existed, that bacteria turned into biologists over millions of years. But that's not what the evidence supports. Just because we see changes doesn't prove that those changes are unlimited. In fact, the changes that an evolutionist would need have to build up genetic information. Like the instructions that are written in DNA, that's what codes for various building blocks of our bodies, like the proteins that make us up. And so in our DNA, years ago, the scientists realized there is a genetic code where it's very much like letters in the English alphabet. It's not that the laws of physics and chemistry turn these chemical letters into an organism. It's that the arrangement of the letters spells out instructions for how to make our bodies. And atheists acknowledge this today, that there's information in the genome, in our DNA. Enough information, Richard Dawkins says, in a single human cell to store the Encyclopedia Britannica, all 30 volumes of it, 3 or 4 times over. And so here's why this is a challenge, this information argument against evolution. It's because, in principle, if their idea of the tree of life is true, at one time in that evolutionary story, there were living things. Say, when the first life appeared, they were single-celled creatures. And those single-celled organisms did not have the genetic instructions in their DNA to make tree bark. Trees had not yet evolved. Later on in the evolutionary story, maybe there were trees around, but there were no birds yet. And none of the organisms alive at the time had genetic instructions to make feathers or wings. How did those things come about? The evolutionists tell us it's natural processes alone, blind forces of nature that write these genetic instructions. So if we're looking at changes in living things and the evolutionists say this is evidence for evolution, you can't just look at any old change and say, oh yeah, that supports the story. It has to be the type of change that can add new instructions, that builds complex machinery in our bodies, things like tree bark or feathers and so on. And so the changes that we see around us, this is the question we should put to evolutionists. Are they typically producing complex new instructions, new information, or are they rather degrading, destroying information, or just sorting it out in a neutral way without writing new instructions? And the typical examples they give of changes do not add new information. And we can look at specific changes they point to, like natural selection. Now, this is a real process that creationists agree with. We can use it to explain how we got all the dogs, and not just domestic dogs, which would be artificial selection, but what about the broader canine kind, which includes wolves and coyotes and dingoes and jackals? It's natural selection that produced those differences in these canines. And how does that work? Well, here's a simple illustration of how the genetics can affect organisms, and this will be an illustration of natural selection, but what I want you to see is that it's not a case of adding new information. So imagine there are two wolf-like creatures that came off of Noah's Ark, and they have a couple of genes that code for their fur length, and they come in two varieties. You can have an L version of the gene, which stands for long fur, or S, which stands for short fur. And some genes work like this. They're codominant. And so when you've got an L and an S, then you have medium length fur. And so let's imagine that the two wolf-like creatures that came off the ark, they both have medium fur. They've got an L and an S gene. But once this pair breeds together and produces offspring, what will their offspring look like? Well, the genes can get shuffled around, and the offspring inherit two from each parent. So some of them will have two S genes. Some will have an L and an S, like mom and dad, and others will have two L genes. Okay, well, so far, has any evolution occurred? No, we've not introduced any new genes. We just sorted out the genes that were already there. But then, let's imagine natural selection takes place. What happens, say, if all the dogs in a certain region are in a really cold climate? There's a really harsh winter, and so which dogs are going to die out from the fierce cold? It's going to be those without enough fur, right? So the dogs with medium and short fur are all eliminated. Who's left? Only the long fur dogs. And so when they go on to produce offspring, what will their offspring look like? Well, notice we've gotten rid of genes, right? There's only L's left, and so all their offspring will now have long fur. So on the surface, in just a few generations, we've gone from medium fur dogs to long fur dogs. That looks like evolution, evolutionists might say. But is it an example of new information being added? No, it's information being taken away, removed from the population so they can no longer produce short fur. So this is typically the way it works. Natural selection, in principle, can only remove things from the population and not add something new. It's not a good example of evolution. It's a good example of adaptation within a kind. And notice how if you try to change the process and go back the other direction now, with only long-furred dogs, if there's a really hot summer and they die of heat stroke, they're not going to evolve back into medium fur or short fur dogs because the information is no longer available. And so when we look at actual creatures in the wild, probably the more robust ancestor was something like a wolf, and our domestic varieties of dogs have descended from them by removing and sorting through the information that was there in the beginning. And you can even get to the point where there's very little information left at all in certain dog breeds, right? I mean, the Chihuahuas are swimming in the shallow end of the gene pool, if you didn't know. They've got all sorts of harmful mistakes in their DNA. And that leads us to the next point, to talk about mutations. Mutations are also something that creationists agree with. You might have a dog with normal, healthy legs, but as his DNA instructions are copied, when he's passing it on to the next generation, if there's a copying mistake, that can damage the instructions, and maybe a dog is born with short, stubby little legs. A lot of mutations are just a single letter change in our DNA, almost like if you're typing out a phrase on your keyboard and you hit the wrong key, and instead of typing this phrase, you type this phrase. Now, evolutionists will say, see, there too, that's a change. That proves evolution. But hang on, if we've changed the genetic instructions to something like this that's gobbledygook, that's not an example of increasing information. You've just corrupted the information. In English, there's no such word as you knew. And the same thing applies in biology with DNA. There's a lot of ways that you can change DNA to simply damage and corrupt it without producing some new instruction that builds some new complex feature that helps life to survive. Now, it's not as though it's impossible in principle to find examples of this. Like in English, you could accidentally make a change, a typo, and by chance come up with new information. For example, I came across this sign in a parking lot years ago. Violators will be towed and fined $50. That sounds pretty good to me, right? That's clearly not what the sign was originally intended to say. There's a missing E that changes the meaning. And so just by chance, there's a mistake, and it still is a meaningful instruction or meaningful information in English. In the same way, it's possible by chance that mutations could produce something new, new instructions, new information. But overwhelmingly, they destroy information. And it's sort of intuitively obvious why. In English, it's the same in biology. Most of what mutations produce is gobbledygook. Now, it's obvious on the surface many times how information is destroyed by mutations. Take, for example, this poor rooster here. He has a mutation that destroys his ability to make feathers. And so scientists refer to this as the TNR mutation, which means totally naked rooster. Can't produce feathers because the mutation destroyed that information. It's obvious how that's a loss, right? God built these chickens with the ability to have feathers. Mutations destroyed that information. But what about a case like this, where you have a bird whose feathers grow more and more because of a mutation? Isn't that an example of new instructions, new information being added? No, because this creature, by the way, ought to look like this. This is what the healthy budgerigars look like, but he's got a mutation that makes his feathers not stop growing. But the reason this is also a loss of information is because the birds have a genetic switch in their DNA that tells the feathers to stop growing after a certain amount of time, and it's the mutations that corrupted that genetic switch that broke even that. And so his feathers grow more and more, but it's still a loss of information. Now, what about a case where you have a duplication, where maybe a gene gets copied? Or we see this on the surface in creatures like this mutant turtle. It's not ninja as far as I know, but has a mutation that caused him to grow 2 heads instead of 1. Is that a good example of new information? Well, if you've read the newspaper and then you read a second copy of it, are you twice as informed as you were after the first read? Only if you don't remember very well, right? We don't need evolution to explain how you get a second head after the instructions to make a head already exist. We want them to explain how you get the instructions to make a head in the first place. And so even duplications like this aren't typically good examples of new instructions, new information being created by natural processes. Now, it's also true that defects, mutations, can be a defect, but even those defects can be beneficial to the organism. They can help it to survive better than it would have otherwise. And this is something Charles Darwin himself observed when he traveled to these various islands in the Galapagos. On some of these islands, he noticed there were beetles that have no wings, but he compared them to beetles on the mainland, and they looked almost identical, but the mainland beetles did have wings. And Darwin correctly figured out that the wingless beetles on these windy islands, they were descended from beetles from the mainland that had wings in their past. Some of these winged beetles flew to the island, and somehow something about the island made them lose their wings due to mutations. And the reason for that may be a lot of modern scientists recognize that on a windy island, it would take a lot of energy to fly around, search for food, look for a mate. It's actually more efficient to just crawl around and find those things. And so mutations knocked out those wings, and they don't really need them. It's actually a benefit not to have them, not to expend that energy on these windy islands. And so in that case, though, is it a good example of information being added? No, again, it's the wings being destroyed rather than the instructions to make wings being written in the first place. So even when it's a benefit to the organism, it's still a loss of information. And so there really aren't good examples of information gaining mutations that would lead us to believe that evolution is true. So we've looked at 3 arguments for evolution: the vestigial structures, the similarities in living things, the changes in living things. Let's last look at the cruelty in nature. Now, you can see how this is not a scientific argument, but it's more of a theological argument. What am I referring to by the cruelty in nature? Well, many evolutionists argue in this way. Have you ever seen one of these documentaries on BBC or Nova or the Discovery Channel where they're talking about nature, and they give all the credit for the designs of living things to evolution rather than God? And I'm sure for many Christians that's frustrating. And so one of the narrators of these documentaries is the British naturalist Sir David Attenborough, who does not believe in God or design of living things. He's a fierce defender of evolution. And so many Christians that are upset with the narrator, David Attenborough, they've written letters to him and asked him, why can't you give glory to God? Why can't you see the handiwork of the Creator in all this amazing life. And Attenborough has answered those letters in a variety of formats. Here's what he says. When creationists talk about God creating, they always instance hummingbirds or orchids, sunflowers, and beautiful things. But I tend to think instead of a parasitic worm that is boring through the eye of a boy sitting on the bank of a river in Africa that's going to make him blind. And I ask the creationists, are you telling me that the God you believe in, who you also say is an all-merciful God who cares for each one of us, are you saying that God is the designer of all life? Because that would include this parasitic worm. And that doesn't seem to me to coincide with a God who's full of mercy. Well, that is a sober challenge from the likes of David Attenborough. But do Christians have an answer to this challenge? What can we say about the parasites in the world, the harmful things, the cruelty in nature, all the death and the disease and the suffering that goes on all around us? It's not as though the Bible doesn't explain that, because the Bible says that, yes, when God first made the world, he designed it to be very good and to function well without any defects or harmful mutations or parasites. But how did those things come about? Because Adam and Eve sinned. And therefore, mutations began to occur and things deteriorated. And so most parasites we can actually recognize scientifically came from ancestors that didn't need a host to survive. Most poisons are good things in the right settings. It's only when you get too much of a good thing or put it in the wrong location and so forth that things become poisonous. Most bacteria are good bacteria, useful in digestion like we talked about earlier. It's only a small subset that are harmful and things that cause ulcers and all the diseases that we see. It's consistent with what the Bible says about the fall. And so we need to keep that in mind, not just that God is creator, but the book of Genesis tells us the true history of the world, that the world became corrupted soon after it was made. It's very much like, there's another well-known creation speaker who says he was once at a museum and looking at all these Greek and Roman statues that they have there, and there was a crowd of people around admiring it. They said, it's magnificent, beautiful, incredible. But there was also a little boy nearby who said, what are you folks talking about? It seems broken to me. Now, both things are actually correct, aren't they? That the statues are magnificent artistry, but they're also broken. Do you realize the same thing is true about the world we live in today? And oftentimes, we as Christians want to convince non-believers that there's a God of love out there who made this incredible world. It's inspiring and beautiful and well-designed. But the atheists like David Attenborough say, what are you talking about? It looks broken to me. Well, they're not wrong that it is broken, but the Bible explains the brokenness. And atheism can't account for those things, why there is goodness and evil in the world. It's only a biblical worldview that makes sense of all aspects of the world that we live in. But the good news is that God is not going to leave the world in this state, right? The Bible teaches he's not only creator, but he's also the redeemer. And he sent his son on a rescue mission from heaven to pay for our sins on the cross, dying in our place, taking the punishment we deserved, so that we can be forgiven. But also, as it says in Colossians 1, what was Jesus' purpose? That in him he would that all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And so it's the work of the cross that makes it possible for us to have a new heavens and a new earth where God will restore things to the way they once were, without death and disease and parasites and so on. This is good news that we have as Christians. So, let's summarize what we've learned in this hour. We've looked at 4 reasons that supposedly prove evolution and seen there are actually better evidences that support creation. Just like that Martian landscape, when you dive into the sophistication, the complexity, the details, vestigial structures, yeah, there are some, but most are functional after all. That's consistent with creation followed by the fall. The similarities in living things, they're not proof of one common ancestor for all of life. They're proof of a common designer, one God responsible for making all living things. We've looked at the changes that occur in living things today that we can observe in front of us. We've seen that these changes don't add new information and build up organisms over time. They destroy and degrade information. Yeah, they can allow organisms to adapt and survive and even be beneficial changes sometimes, but they're still losses of information, not writing brand new complex instructions. Last, we looked at the cruelty in nature, and we saw that this can be explained through a biblical worldview. It's a consequence of the fall, beginning with Adam and Eve. And so there's lots more arguments in favor of evolution, but that also, when you examine the details, they point more strongly to creation. But hopefully, the few that we've looked at in this hour give you confidence of this, that living things still shout design. The more you look at the details, the more obvious it is that God is the creator. And so our ministry wants to come alongside you and equip you to defend your faith and know why you believe, be able to respond to challenges of our skeptical age. We have a number of resources that I'll highlight briefly now as I wrap up here that can help you to do that. We have a great magazine, comes in print and digital form, 4 issues a year. It's full color. In every issue, we highlight a different fascinating creature that God made, like the mimic octopus we had a story about a few years back. Now, you might know that many octopuses can change their skin to camouflage themselves, but the mimic is particularly incredible because it changes its color and texture and shape to impersonate different animals, at least 15 that we know about. And here's a little video clip to show you the mimic octopus in action. Notice how it puts all its tentacles behind it to imitate this flatfish, a flounder, swimming along the ocean floor. Here it gives itself a stripy black and white pattern and recoils into a hole to imitate a poisonous sea snake that other creatures won't want to mess with. That was the real sea snake on the screen as well. There's a lionfish imitation, then the real lionfish for comparison, another poisonous creature that you don't want to tangle with. The mimic can also do a lot of other things that you can see it transform right here in real time. Isn't that amazing? And a lot of times we don't know what it's doing, like walking on the seafloor here, carrying along some coral or something. Just incredible creatures that God made, and this points to his hand as the designer. So we talk about those sorts of things in our magazine as well as our books and DVDs. We've got a great DVD, my favorite one, on the book tables back there called Evolution's Achilles Heels, where we dismantle the arguments for evolution, and we interview 15 Bible-believing PhD scientists to show that evolution has fatal flaws. And not just in biology, but also in evolutionary geology and evolutionary cosmology, the Big Bang, and all these sorts of things. A good book on dinosaurs, if you want to find out how to understand them from a biblical perspective, is Titans. This book that covers things like feathered dinosaurs. Have they really been discovered? This is what our children are being taught today by documentaries and toys and all sorts of things, Jurassic World movies, that dinosaurs turned into birds. Not true, and that book provides the evidence. We have a website as well, lots of great information there, and so you can find lots of free material, articles and video content on creation.com. And I'll just leave you then for this hour with a verse from Hebrews. There it says that every house is built by someone. Yeah, houses are obviously designed as well, right? But the builder of all things is the Lord God. And so evolutionists want to give credit to nature itself, as though living things just make themselves and they just happen without any designing hand. But no, the atheists are mistaken. Design in living things is not an illusion. Just like that Martian hillside, the more you examine the details, the more clear it becomes that creatures are the handiwork of their creator. All right. Well, I will leave it there for this hour, and hope you'll stick around for the main service. God bless.
All right, thank you, Kenton, for coming and sharing. Right now, we're going to take a short break. At 11 o'clock, we'll start back with our worship service, and Kenton will be speaking during that time also. We have coffee and snacks back there in the back. We welcome you here and hope you'll stick around for the second session we have in just a few minutes.